Perfect. Thank you, Tony. And if anyone has any issue, you can still speak up. Okay. So to dive in, do we have Kevin here now? Do you know Rebecca?
I don't see him on the screen yet. Oh, he's asking for it to be resent by email. Okay, just a moment.
Okay. Well, we can have Herman speak first. So diving in, we do have luckily two Green Jobs Oshawa members who are going to kick off this conversation. So we'll start actually with Herman, who worked at a General Motors plant and later as a staff person for the Canadian Auto Workers, and he's now retired. And he's going to share a range of different experiences he's had with attempts at environmental or just transition focused organizing in the labor movement. After that, hopefully, if he can make it into the call, we have Kevin, who's a former supplier worker here in Oshawa, and he'll be talking about the ups and downs of how people here responded to the closure of the GM assembly plant throughout 2018 and 2019. Hopefully touching on that theme that the labor movement is not a monolith and there are different levels of proactivity and different priorities among workers. So that's the kind of opening two speakers, starting probably around 1:20, 1:25. It's your turn to speak. So I'll introduce everyone here one at a time by name and organization when it's your turn. And as you know, we're hoping folks can keep their comments to around 5 minutes. Other than that, you're pretty open to talk about whatever you think is important today. And feel free to interact and ask each other questions in the chat. Start thinking about a takeaway idea or an action item you can share in our second round, which will be more of a lightning round conversation before we wrap up. So just as a final note, we'll be taking a break around 2:20 after everyone has done their 5 minutes, and then we'll wrap up hopefully around 3 o'clock. So I'm going to pass it over to Herman to start.
Okay, you don't mind, Kevin. I'm gonna go first. Anyway.
Oh, Kevin's here now. It does. I don't.
Here, so
either way.
Okay, let me do. I won't be that long. My first experience with the environmental movement of sorts was I worked in an auto assembly plant. It used to be in as a General Motors van plant in Eglinton Avenue in Scarborough, which closed in '93, but they announced the closure in '89. And we had a campaign for an electric van, and we had an engagement with. I was a union rep there, and I was on the bargaining committee, so I'm also the person who, one of the people who took the lead in this campaign. And we had a conversation with a sort of a conservative environmental organization called Energy Probe, which was supported privatization and those kinds of things. However, they raised issues which we never even thought about. Some of the issues they raised were not very right-wing stuff, but they raised questions about how about the power, the electric power. Were we going to talk about what about the materials that will go into these vans? What about increasing the amount of personal vehicles that will be on the road? Those kinds of questions. And our perspective was, I know my perspective as well. So who are they to bring these things up? You know, we want to be able to have a new investment and stuff. So I thought I was a great environmentalist, but I really wasn't all that. And, aside from the other things that those people did, we in fact, that's how we responded to those folks. My second experience was very soon afterwards, which was a much more positive one. And I learned a lot more there, was with what they call the Green Work Alliance, where there was a closure of a Caterpillar plant that made industrial equipment in Brampton. And a number of progressive environmentalists in the union and people who had been involved in the environmental movement who were more older, even older than I was then, they were part of this idea of having that workplace produce something that people in the community would need. And they did canvassing in the community and stuff. And it was a very positive experience because we learned a lot from about how to do that kind of thing. It was tolerated and supported by the union, and the people that were involved were people who have been involved in the environmental movement in various ways, and also in transitioning. for years, and I learned a lot from those people. And I helped change my perspective. The third experience was in Free Transit Toronto, where we looked to expand free transit to a broader piece because we had a very small group. And interestingly enough, a lot of the people who were involved in that project, which sort of died with the pandemic, were young environmentalists from this Climate Justice Toronto. And they were open, they wanted to work with the labor movement, and they had all kinds of very important contributions to make. And just listening to them was critical. And they were very open to the labor movement. They wanted workers to play a role. And they were not the kind of environmentalists that looked to private markets to solving problems. And I guess the final piece is Green Jobs Oshawa now, and other people will be talking about it. And some of the principles around bringing labor and the environment together around this are really important. They have to do with class, they have to do with public ownership, they have to do with democratic planning, and they also have to do with not producing increasing consumer waste and the auto dependence. It's a very, very important step forward, and it has a lot to do with the contributions of the environmental movement. I guess to summarize, I've been asked to say two things. One is, what are some of the lessons for either side? I think labor needs to free itself from its pandemic ties to endemic, not pandemic, it's a bad word, to employers' interests, because you're tied to a particular employer. And without a broader perspective on fundamental change, a union will just automatically, as the defaults, do things that'll help the employer do better, so they'll have more workers there. And not just the employer, but also the sector that the employer works in. This needs to be broken. You need to go beyond that towards a broader, deeper, class-oriented approach. Second of all, obviously, that to take an environmental approach is to look at your role as a working class people in helping to transform society as a whole. You need to see the environmental movement as a necessary ally that you can learn from in the transformation and that you have to rely upon. And from the environmental perspective, you need to see the interests of working people as central to any transformation. Because in particular, if you think that the solution has to be with some form of challenge to capitalism and dependence on private accumulation, which always builds certain kinds of growth and it's dependent upon certain kind of consumption patterns, that only working people, which is the vast majority of people, have a potential to try and change these things. And you need to learn about some of the problems that unions and workers face in terms of the dependence on employers, and to take that into account, not necessarily to genuflect towards it, but to challenge it. And I think the final piece is that there's a lot of the environmental movement is tied to private sector solutions, business orientation, market ways of doing things, and we know how that operates. That has to be challenged within the movement itself. So that's what I would say. And I guess the final thing is we have to talk and work together as much as we possibly can, because that's how these things get ironed out. Okay, thanks.
That's amazing. Thank you, Herman. So Kevin, I'm going to pass it over to you. I'm glad you were able to make it in. We always have a little bit of confusion in our Green Jobs Oshawa chat because we have so many different Zoom links always going on. But Kevin, if you're ready to say a few words, just unmute and go ahead.
Hello, everybody. I'll start off with a little bit about myself. I was a part of the supplier plants for General Motors. And so that's where I got to meet Tony and Rebecca and Sam and Chris. So during that time, we were trying to make some positive changes within our local. And as most of you are aware, how GM closed and then miraculously came back to life in 12 months. But having said that, what put me on to Green Jobs Oshawa is that during this, between 2018 and 2019, there was a fight going on to try to save General Motors and things like that. But as a supplier, and I'm sure a better description of a supplier plant worker or how we were treated will come to me after I say this out loud. But we just figured that our dues were booze and hooker money. So excuse that expression, but I believe that is truly a very accurate description on how we were treated. So as this fight was going on, it was basically all about GM. So when that fight ceased, and we still realized as supplier workers we were going to get nothing for our efforts, that GM was going to close, and our local was just there wasn't an afterwards. There wasn't what's going to go forward. We were told that there was going to be a footprint later on. We were told there was going to be a footprint of 300 people. Very depressing to say the least. And to suggest that we were an afterthought is an understatement. So along comes Green Jobs Oshawa, a group that I already had the privilege of working before with, and they were offering not only a real choice. It's not really a choice. It was to go further than what just making a car was, right? It's something farther than just, hey, we're going into negotiations after 3 years, and we're going to give up some more stuff just so we make sure that we have a job. Green Jobs Oshawa was looking to, had a good idea about, let's try this with General Motors. Let's try to take over the plant, for the lack of a better description, and provide better paying jobs. They wanted to be very inclusive. They wanted everybody in, and unfortunately, our local was not was anything other than they were not inclusive whatsoever. They wanted to get this over with. We had lost a ton of jobs. Let's get some people some buyouts and move on. And they all seemed very happy with 300 jobs in a footprint. With Green Jobs Oshawa and the timing of it, as a supplier worker, not only are you mourning the death of your job, and over 10 years, you're told every year, you know what, it will get better, it will get better. And then at the end of the day, it just didn't. So you hear a refreshing idea. You hear something that I will be the first to say, an environmentalist, no. I was not thinking that way. I was looking to try to make $1 and survive from 1 week to the next. And so when Green Jobs came, I hopped aboard immediately thinking, you know what, I was very narrow-minded. They were thinking far more broadly than me just hoping to have a job in 3 or 5 years. But this was sustainable. This had meat to it, where, you're looking at General Motors, who clearly doesn't care about anybody, except their bottom line. So this was something that was truly tangible. But unfortunately, trying to pass this on to my coworkers at that time was next to impossible. You had people looking good activists, people that were fighting the good fight in order to try to keep GM alive, and for a whole wide array of issues, going, are they going to get me a job tomorrow? Am I going to see a job next month or in 2020? And the answer was obviously going to be no. And that just turned a lot of people off immediately because they couldn't see farther than that. Our local and our national in particular had absolutely no will to even recognize Green Jobs Oshawa unless it was a shot. It was just they just completely ignored us, which was disappointing at best, at least. nobody could get involved because we were all so used to coming in second with the local. And then you see that if the local had backed us even a little bit, I think we would have been far more successful in trying to get more people involved. Even now that GM has started to come back, you're looking at supplier people in particular. They can't see that Green Jobs Oshawa. They can't see that environmental. They might, to do this right now, to think about it, to talk about it, they would not be, they're going, this doesn't get me a job. This does not get me a paycheck. And so it's very difficult without the backing of your local and the national in particular. They don't, it's a daunting task to try to bring any kind of information to the floor, because you're even at the local level, you're looking at politics, and it doesn't do the environment or anybody else any justice. But that's just the monster that we have here in Oshawa. Pardon me. Maybe in a year from now, there might be more interest. But for now, you're looking at a lot of people that they're more concerned about getting a job than to joining Green Jobs Oshawa and the possibility of not getting a job simply because you belong to Green Jobs Oshawa. You know, and that's not being dramatic. That's being actually really accurate. Your politics plays a big part in our local, as in many, and people, everybody has their own ideas. So it's very difficult to try to make a positive change when you're having so much up against you. In particular, I mean, you look at Green Jobs, we did a successful campaign with masks, and I like to believe that we had a part in that, in getting masks into GM and being made. But again, you have a national that takes shots at you for doing what? For trying to save the environment, for trying to make some positive change, and for trying to include people. And it's very disheartening when you hear these things. You know, hello? Oh, okay. Anyways, in closing, you know what, when you look at Green Jobs Oshawa, they were trying to include everybody. It was an excellent plan without anybody. We didn't have anybody's shoulders to stand on. Fortunately enough, we're going in different directions that will make a positive change in other areas. And without them, we would, at least in Oshawa, we would just be sitting back and waiting for the next phone call, be a supplier or be at GM, and then be at their beck and call on whether or not we're going to have a job, and for how long, we don't know. Green Jobs Oshawa is truly a plan that would be nice if we had more backing to spread their ideals, our ideas. But I think that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
No, sorry if I cut you off.
No, that's okay. I'm reading at the same time, so that's okay. Thanks.
No, that was great, Kevin. That was such a good summary of how things went down in Oshawa, with the local, with the national. And that's really like a whole other prong of our work. We do this outreach to environmentalists, and we're very warmly received. And I think we've been strategic planning, and our other area of focus is trying to try again in Oshawa to get that real engagement from people right here in our city and from workers and maybe from the local one day far down the line. And yeah, I think it's a good reminder for people who are more on the environmental side of things that there really are challenges within the labor movement that have to be thought about very concretely. So on that note, we can get into our reflections on organizing for a just transition. And we're going to start according to the speaking order that I emailed out earlier today to participants. We're going to start with Lisa from Climate Justice Ottawa. So Lisa, I'm sorry putting you on the spot to go first, but if you're ready, we're so excited to hear from you.
It's like ripping off a Band-Aid. I gotta like get it over with first, so I don't mind at all. Yeah, so my name is Lisa Gunn, and as Francesca said, I organize with Climate Justice Ottawa, and we're based on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. So when I was looking at the questions that were provided for us to think on, I thought it'd be interesting to sort of share what Climate Justice Ottawa is doing on Green New Deal organizing. So in Ottawa, we have a municipal election in October of 2022, and we're starting to think about that now. So we sort of have a 3-phase plan. And the first phase is sort of what I'll be talking about mostly, which is sort of the outreach to different community groups. So our plan is to, we've identified different areas of interest that we think should be included in the Green New Deal, and have started doing outreach to community groups and organizations that work on those to seek input for our phase 2, which is still sort of up in the air, but might be compiling that input to create our own platform of what we think a Green New Deal should be on. And then in phase 3, start mobilizing Get Out the Vote campaigns. And James was lucky enough to be in our very first outreach group when we were talking about transit with Free Transit Ottawa. So that's one area that we were focusing on. We've done outreach to food justice groups, disability justice, racial justice, and defunding the police work, Indigenous rights, other environmental groups. It's kind of a whole slew of other ones. Strangely enough, I don't know if we have unions on it. So this is a very good reminder to add sort of identifying which labor groups in Ottawa can kind of have an impact on municipal organizing and start doing some outreach to them. Yes, we've started doing that initial outreach to the different organizations and groups, and the biggest success in this so far has been the really big interest and appetite for doing this type of organizing and understanding the intersection between these different issues and climate. So some of the groups that we've done outreach to are thrilled that we're talking to them about these issues because they're usually ignored in conversations. So when we were doing outreach to the Parkdale Food Center, which does food justice work and sort of, food access for neighbors in need, they were really excited that we were talking to them not only about municipal organizing, but also about how food access and food justice intersects with climate change and climate justice, because they've identified that no one really ever talked to them about those issues. And they kind of mapped out how, if you look at the way that food is transported to food banks, the way that it's distributed, it's not really getting at the root cause of why people don't have access to food in the first place. And then similarly, the person who was doing outreach to disability groups, they were also incredibly excited that people were even talking to them. Because it said usually when people talk about any type of organizing or any type of election mobilization, these groups aren't usually included in these types of conversations. So I think that's definitely the biggest takeaway in sort of doing this type of work, is really understanding that by bringing people together who are often siloed, we can really sort of to create a broader coalition to really push forward these issues and these things that we need in order to have a sustainable and livable future for everybody. The flip side, one of the challenges is understanding that there are so many groups doing different types of work and ensuring that we're not replicating the labor that is being done, especially around municipal organizing. There's other groups that have sort of the exact same plan as us at different scales and capacities, and trying to figure out who's doing what and how can we build off of the work that other people are doing rather than doing the same work for the same goals, but not really coordinating our efforts. But I think in solving one of those challenges is sort of going back to the success, where if you sort of establish those relationships with the groups that you want to do work with and take the lead from them, then you can start to coordinate your efforts a bit more and really ensure that what you're doing is what's needed and wanted by those who have the lived experience of the issues that you're working on, and also building the relationships to build that broader coalition of that work. So really my biggest takeaway from this is the importance of sort of breaking down those silos and building those conversations and having those conversations with groups who usually don't speak to each other, because that's how you can kind of build the solidarity and allyship that's needed to create Green New Deal organizing, municipal campaigns, just transition work. But on the title of the Green New Deal, sort of answering one of the other questions, internally at Climate Justice Ottawa, we call it a Green New Deal municipal campaign. But when we've done our outreach to other groups, we don't really use that language because we're not sure how that tracks to other groups, because there is sort of this broad misunderstanding of what a Green New Deal is and confusion about what's included, who does it support, who doesn't it include. So I think that could be a really interesting conversation to have here in terms of how do we, if we know that different groups have these same ideas and principles and visions of what the future looks like, how do we find language that kind of encapsulates it all, but doesn't leave people sort of ostracized from the conversation? Yes, that's my brief overview of sort of what we're doing and sort of the wins and challenges that we've had, and maybe a question for discussion moving forward. Thanks.
That was amazing. Thank you, Lisa. So next we have Josh from Free Transit Ottawa, who I think Lisa mentioned was also included in this municipal Green New Deal platform development. So Josh, take it away.
Thank you, friend Jessica. I first just want to say I'm also located on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. I just want to, say thank you for the organizers for this, for inviting me, and also for the sort of prompt questions that you sent. I think they actually really helped me reflect on my own organizing and my own work. Those were very helpful. I also just want to say I feel a bit hesitant or uncomfortable speaking to these issues, but I also think that's probably not an uncommon feeling. And to a certain extent, I think right now is the perfect time to sort of try to get over those, because I think this is the moment when there's a moment of experimentation. There's a moment that we need to try things. I think and I feel that there is a sort of revitalization on the left of leftist movements. This is also a time of obviously COVID and making many of the issues that we speak to more visible for people. And the powers that we're trying to change, of course, are also in flux and trying to deal with these things. And so I think this is a moment when we need to try things. And so I'm going to sort of, I'll just really briefly speak to what Free Transit Ottawa has done and is doing around just transition work. And then I'll sort of just give my own sort of thoughts on moving forward with just transition. Free Transit Ottawa definitely prior to COVID was sort of involved in attempting to expand our base. We were using things like campaign for a petition as well as canvassing. We obviously identified immediately that transit users are probably going to be a significant base for us. But we also tried to broaden that quite a bit. And so at events, we did have ATU members, the OC Transpo Union. We had ATU members speak at our events. More recently, we've had a couple actually join our organization, which has been great. They provide a lot of amazing insight for us. In terms of doing that, though, it was a matter of identifying shared interests. There was no real secret sauce to it. It was the idea that an expanded free transit system, the idea that free transit would bring more people into the transit system. This would mean more good, safe union jobs for transit workers. And it would also, of course, mean, in terms of something like Green Jobs Oshawa, more manufacturing jobs for the types of vehicles that need to be produced. And so these were shared interests that we kind of identified and wanted to speak to. And of course, fighting against the constant underfunding of services like transit as well and others. And so these are the type of things that we had aligned interests, and we organized around those. Of course, COVID has caused a bit of issue for the sort of broadening the base organizing that we were doing. And so we kind of changed tracks and we started identifying other groups that we could, or campaigns that we could get involved in and sort of find other groups in Ottawa that wanted to work on the same issues. And so as Lisa mentioned, we've been involved in that conversation around the municipal election. We've also been active in an alt budget, People's Coalition for an Alternative Budget for Ottawa. And we've also been involved with an organization called Summer Street West Community Health Center, which is doing a lot of work around user fees and access to municipal services. And of course, a user fee like transit, but it can also be many other things. And so finding those shared interests, those shared common purposes has been the way that we've, during COVID, we feel like it's difficult to broaden the base in terms of convincing people who aren't already like-minded to join us, but we can find people who are and sort of increase our power that way. In terms of just transition broadly, I think that's a big part of it. It speaks to a number of interests, and it brings them together. And also, I think, honestly, it centers morality, which I think is important. I think we've sort of lost that to economization and neoliberal speak, that everything has to, be counted. So I think the recentering of morality is important. But I also think the centering of particular interests of groups that Just Transition can do. I mean, obviously it speaks to environmental concerns, but obviously, as Kevin mentioned earlier, it speaks to the quality of life and well-being and dignity of workers, of course. I was at a recent conference on Indigenous climate action where Just Transition was being used in conjunction with issues around Indigenous energy sovereignty. And of course, it speaks to the issues of democratizing production processes, which of course Green Jobs Oshawa speaks to. And that's vitally important. Production processes need to be changed if we're going to avoid climate catastrophe. And so these interests overlap, and they can help to build our base of power to change the structure, to change inequality, to change unequal structures of power, to change to move us in the right direction. I think the key going forward, for me at least, and I think we're increasingly seeing this with things like the Liberal Party using the term just transition, or other groups using the just transition, not in the same way that I think we mean it. And I think that's really important. The just in just transition, it can't just be transactional. It can't just be, a compensation for loss. It is that, but it's also much more. It has to be about economic justice, but it also has to be about gender justice, about racial justice. It has to be about the democratization. It has to be about disability justice. So we need to ensure that they do not change the terms of the debate on us. And in terms of the transition, and I think this is the one that they use a lot, and they try to change it, which is it can't just be about moving away from fossil fuels, transitioning away from fossil fuels, or even just transitioning away from emissions. It has to be about transitioning away from fossil capital. It has to be about transitioning away from neoliberal practices and policies that do underfund things like transit, that exploit workers. The transition has to be away from these power structures that are central to not only inequality, but also, of course, climate justice. And so I think I'll end it there. Thanks again. Perfect.
Thank you. I'm already so jazzed by just two people who've managed to cram so much into 10 minutes. In the list I sent out today, the next person would be Nicholas from Climate Justice Toronto, but he had let me know that he wasn't sure if he could make it, and I don't think he's here. So I'm just going to give one quick shout. If Nicholas, if you're here, speak up. But if not, then the next person is Addie from Climate Justice Durham.
Awesome. Can you hear me?
Yep. Hi.
Awesome. Cool. So just go ahead. Yeah. All right. Hi there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Hi there. My name is Adeline Cohen. I'm a member of Climate Justice Durham. So we're based on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, and we live on land impacted by the Williams Treaty. We are a multi-generational group of volunteers advocating for meaningful climate-based change with the goal of ensuring a livable and sustainable future. And one of the ways that we want to do this is by supporting a just transition. So one of the ways one of the things that I think we can do is just share the fact that we know that fossil fuels are going away. Recently, the IEA, which is the International Energy Agency, released a report that said that the era of fossil fuel use is ending, and that any new investment is a waste of money that puts our future in serious jeopardy. And the IEA is quite conservative and has been criticized in the past for being overly optimistic about the future of oil. So to hear them say this is really like watching, the rats flee the sinking ship. And if the fossil fuel industry is dying, there are so many adjacent industries that will die as well. We're looking at so many communities that are reliant on polluting job providers, these jobs that won't exist in 20 years. And if this is inevitable, if like these jobs are going away no matter what we do, then the well-being of workers and communities can't be an afterthought. We can't shut down a job provider and then go, oh, by the way, I guess these people need to be looked after. We can have either a planned and graceful exit from fossil fuels, or we can have, workers caught by surprise when they turn on the television because their employer kept telling them that things would get better when they knew things wouldn't get better. We need this graceful exit, this just transition, where workers' well-being is thought of throughout, and really like integrated into the process of transitioning away from fossil fuels. And one thing that I think is really important is especially hiring older workers. When discussing a just transition, I'm talking about training people to work in industries and using those transferable skills and stuff. And in these discussions, one of the things that I keep on hearing is, oh, but like older workers, like what if they don't get hired because they've only got 5 years left in the industry? What happens to them? You can train someone, but if they don't get hired, that's still a problem. Yeah, you can teach an old dog new tricks, but you need to make sure he actually gets hired. So one of the principles that I think is really important is centering the well-being of people. Like the climate movement sometimes get accused of being or they have this image of being, so-called tree huggers, or about only caring about preventing this statistical 2-degree increase in the global average temperature, or about being obsessed with punishing people in the fossil fuel industries. But those are all incorrect and those are all wrong. It's about the well-being of people. Both climate movement and labor movements need to be rooted in social justice, and we have a lot of common ground because of this. We have a lot of fronts that we're able to move on faster if we move together, where we're prioritizing the well-being of people. Just coming back to this fact that the fossil fuel industry is dying, it is about the practical reality of what the climate crisis will change in our lives, about what's happening in the fossil fuel industries to make sure that everyone is well, that everyone has access to clean air and water, that there's food security, economic security, and that everyone has equal protection from the impacts of climate change. It's about recognizing that climate action and the well-being of people in fossil fuel industries are not mutually exclusive. We don't have this either or. Either we keep General Motors open, or we, or we prioritize climate justice. We can do both. We're fully capable of doing both. We can serve the community by protecting the planet, and protect the planet by serving the community. And two things that I think are really important to this. First of all, empowering local communities. And second of all, working to push for the government to create a framework to support transitioning. Working at a local level, communities need to have a say, and they need to know that there are better options. That this Green Job Oshawa's idea is a practical one that we can do, that it is the most sustainable option when fossil fuels are probably going to die in the next few decades. we need to make sure that people are empowered, that we as climate movement are lending our support, our networks, our voice, and our manpower to communities. Like if a community in Toronto needs people at a protest, we help make that happen. We help like publicize, we show up. If they need people to send letters to governments, urging them to adopt, whatever policy or plan the community needs, we help do that. The community can know its needs and can be supporting it can help both of us, both of our movements. On a government level, it means that making sure that the government has these structures in place to support a green transition. For example, making sure that the government is prepared to spend that $1.3 billion needed to procure the GM plant. Maybe a fund or some budget set aside specifically to help communities that are reliant on a polluting job provider when that job provider goes away, making sure that there is both a strong civil society and strong government support. This is how I think that we can move together and make sure that, going forward, we have a future that really serves everyone. Yeah.
Thank you, Addie. That was amazing. I am operating off of my own very messily written list, and I actually totally skipped past Amanda, who was supposed to be third. So it's actually going to be Amanda next, with my sincere apologies, and then James, who was after Addie. Just so you know, you'll be right after Amanda. So Amanda, take it away. Oh, and Amanda is from Climate Justice Toronto, and she's the best.
Thanks. Also, your cat is very cute, Fran. So yeah, I guess I'll just start by saying thank you so much to Fran and for everyone who is organizing this and for inviting me. It's really exciting to be in a space where so many people are thinking about just transition in a locally in place context, but still maintaining that global orientation. So yeah, I'm very excited by everything people have been saying so far. A bit about myself. I'm a mixed race Mexican-Canadian settler who was born and raised in Toronto, which is within the territory covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. And I come to the question of just transition and this discussion today kind of from two lenses, both as an organizer and an academic. So I started getting involved in climate justice organizing around 2014. I did initially a lot of work in student movement organizing with fossil fuel divestment, and from there moved into different campaigns against pipelines like the Energy East pipeline, the Kinder Morgan pipeline. I worked on various campaigns with 350.org, a lot of youth climate movement stuff, but trying to bridge divides too between different movements. And I'm now doing my PhD at the University of Toronto, where my research looks at climate justice, activism, and a just transition. So that's kind of the two angles I'm bringing here today. And like Fran said, I'm also an organizer with Climate Justice Toronto, though I wish Nicholas were here because he's been involved longer than I have and could speak more thoroughly to the amazing work CJTO is doing. So yeah, I guess kind of to answer some of the prompts that Fran gave, I think that the dominant conception that I see of like a just transition in mainstream discourse is far too narrow. To kind of riff off a bit of what Joshua was saying, like I do see it discussed mainly in terms of a transition away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. And then sometimes also with the afterthought of like that we need to center both workers and vulnerable communities. And I think that's definitely a big part of it, and it gets to the crux of a lot of it, but I think we need to be expanding our conception of what a just transition is, and that's part of what I'm interested in exploring further. So for me, a just transition invites 4 key questions. One is, what is justice? Second is, what are we transitioning to? Third is, how do we get there? So the process of transition. And fourth is, how do we know that we have gotten there? So how do we evaluate the process and the outcome of a just transition? So I'll just offer like a few thoughts that I have on those questions, but they're honestly still very preliminary for me, both in terms of my research and my organizing in Toronto. But on the question of what is justice, I think justice is a very nebulous term. And from my experience in organizing, I think it's often easier to conceive of injustice than justice. A lot of the time when we use this discourse of justice, I think what we're actually speaking to more is like what we're fighting against, the injustices of capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy. But the nice thing about a just transition is I think it does call for a more future-oriented framing. So what does justice look like rather than just what is injustice? Some of the axes that I think we need to be thinking about here are meaningful low carbon work, Indigenous rights, gender equity, anti-racism, and environmental protection. And within those axes, I really see capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy as being major power structures that we need to be unpacking and working against in our organizing. And then on the question of what are we transitioning to, at a broad level, I would say a socioeconomic system that actually provides for everyone. I really am interested in thinking about post-capitalist futures and moving against the discourse that we can't, that it's too radical, that it's not practical to think about a post-capitalist world. And I think the first step in that is actually like imagining what that could look like at both a local and at other scales. And thinking too about safety, equity, and really just what is a good life? What is a good and meaningful life for everyone? And then for the question of how we get there, to put a bit selfishly to put myself into this equation, I do think there's a need for more community-based research, qualitative on the ground research that is rooted in communities that are doing this kind of work. And that's part of what I hope to do in my PhD going forward. And I also think that in terms of process, just transition is an opportunity to rethink democracy and democratic planning. So how are we going to get there? Like, who's going to be involved? How are we going to do this in a way that actually is equitable in the process, not only in the destination? And I don't think we could get to an equitable destination without an equitable process anyway. And also just echoing what some people have already said about coalitions. I think that's really important to be thinking across movement spaces and doing things like this roundtable today, learning from the work that different communities in different regional and issue area contexts are doing. And then for the last question of how do we know we have gotten there? To be honest, this one is one that I still really feel like I don't know the answer to, and I would be interested if others have thoughts on this, because again, to echo what Joshua was saying earlier, I think there is a really big risk with co-optation and greenwashing. And it's both exciting and concerning to see the idea of a just transition being taken up so broadly. But it is concerning when you see it used in a way that's very clearly not the way I'm conceiving of it, the way others in this room are conceiving of it. So I think we need to think about that evaluation process. Like, how will we know if this actually is a just transition? And how will we know when it's just like neoliberal co-optation that uses the language but doesn't actually like unpack and dismantle structures of exploitation and oppression? So yeah, that's kind of all I had to start for today. Thanks.
Thank you. That was perfect timing, and that was really, that framing of the 4 questions was very good. So next, as mentioned, is James, who's also from Climate Justice Durham and works with Addie.
Thank you. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm with Climate Justice Durham. Full disclosure, I'm also a member of the IWW, so I got a stake in the labor movement here as well. So a just transition is a transition away, obviously, from fossil fuels, but also from capitalism, I feel. It's not enough to make progress in the environmentalist sphere and keep stasis in the labor sphere and the racial justice sphere and so on. Because everybody knows that, you know, a lot of these manufacturing jobs are much more unionized, better off in a lot of ways than retail industry and things like that. But they're still jobs. There's still places you go and work for somebody else, and risk injury. I mean, people use the phrase selling your body to describe sex workers a lot. I think that it's a lot more useful when you're talking about people who go to coal mines to break their backs or manufacturing plants. And I think that we need to see a fusion between the environmentalist movement and the labor movement that hasn't been seen before. Specifically, oh yes, I picked up on some of that stuff in the reading. I wasn't sure how to judge my language here, not to be too radical, but it's good to get some confirmation. I think that the best way that we can achieve this is by pushing for worker co-ops. The idea of the right to buy that was pushed by Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party in the last election, that when any corporation wants to sell itself or go public or close down the workers through the union should have the right to say, we want to buy the company and run it as a cooperative. And this is because a just transition has to happen from the bottom up. It cannot be a top-down thing. We know that the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party are two sides of the same coin. Let's be honest here. They don't care for workers' rights. And on the question of co-optation, which I think is a very important one, I know that I was very excited last year when I saw a lot of rebellion against police violence in America and around the world. Only for a lot of it to be co-opted. The phrase defund the police has, in a lot of ways, become a bit of a buzzword. It doesn't mean much. Not that it's not an important goal, but just that you have to be careful when people mention that they don't always have the same idea. I don't think that worker co-ops are something that can be co-opted by neoliberalism, to be honest. If it's not something that they have much breathing room for, if that makes sense. It's a very simple idea. The people who run the company should be the people that make the company run, and do what you will with that. I will say, it's not necessarily the path to socialism. You don't get worker co-ops and then suddenly, colonialism's gone, capitalism is gone, all these structures of oppression are gone. I think that the strength in worker co-ops and in the idea of the right to buy is that it gives people a window into a world where worker self-management is the norm. The GM plant in Oshawa is probably my main example. Green Jobs Oshawa has been pushing for the idea that the government should own and run the company democratically through the people. But I think that it provides an excellent opportunity to try this out. Sorry, let me just pull up the name. Yeah, the Canadian Worker Cooperative Federation has expressed interest in this. And there is a price problem. It's an expensive facility and it doesn't employ many people right now. At its height in the 80s, it was 23,000 people. When you divide up the billion or so that it would cost, it's a lot of money. It's over $100,000. But it's not a lot when you consider the return on investment that you're getting, and when you consider the interest that it would generate. The GM plant in Oshawa is sort of a symbol of pride for the people of Oshawa, for the people of Durham, for people of Southern Ontario in general. And I know plenty of people that will be more than willing to specifically buy an electric car manufactured by workers managing themselves in Oshawa. I know people that would be proud to drive a car that was built by self-managed workers in Oshawa. And I mean, to get back to the whole question of how do we bring these movements together, it's all about not just checking off environmentalism for labor unions as some other value that they support, and not just checking off labor unions as some other value that environmentalist groups support. We have to do the work to build bridges, which is a time-consuming and energy-consuming process, but it's incredibly important because the workers' movement for us is not just another value that we have to support and another thing that's important in a just transition. It's something that's vitally, strategically important to achieving a just transition. When organized labor comes together with other movements, they can move mountains. It's important for us to think about the coal workers in the UK who work together with gay and lesbian organizations to bring attention to both of their struggles, or to civil rights organizations in the United States that work with labor unions. The various examples of these coalitions, like Green Jobs Oshawa is trying to build right now, are what we really need in order to build a just transition. And I'll say, and just another one of the questions, I think that Green Jobs Oshawa's sort of policy of looking at specific campaigns to engage with is incredibly important. There's the idea, you know, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. You can't look at the entire structure. I mean, you should. It's important to look at the entire structure and say, this is horrible, we need to change it. But we're one group and we need to focus on, well, we're a coalition of groups, and we need to focus on specific campaigns that we can put all of our work into. That's how mountains were moved in the civil rights movement with the NAACP, looking at busing. That's how mountains were moved in pretty much that's how mountains were moved in the Indian independence movement with the SALT strike. And that's what we need to do here with this coalition that we're building.
Thank you, James. I love that super specific exploration of worker co-ops as one kind of experiment that would give a window into a better world. That's awesome. So next we have Sydney, who is another person I know from divestment and other U of T climate activism back in the day, and she now works with the Mining Injustice Solidarity Network. So go ahead, Sydney.
Awesome. Hey, everyone, and thanks, Francesca. So yeah, I got involved in the climate justice movement through the fossil fuel divestment campaign at U of T, which led to my work with a group called the Mining Injustice Solidarity Network, or the acronym MISSIN. And we're a Toronto-based group that organizes against the practices of Canadian mining companies, and we work in solidarity with communities who are impacted by Canadian mining. And we see Toronto as a really strategic place to do that work because almost 75% of the world's mining companies are headquartered in Toronto. So I'll be talking today about mining, but I'm also have been a member of the PSAC and recently QP, but I also now work as a labor lawyer in Toronto. And I'm from Oshawa. My family ended up in Oshawa because of GM and work. So all of these issues are really important to me, and I'm excited to be here today. So the main thing that I'll speak to is how the government's relying on mining to facilitate a just transition, or what they're calling a just transition. And and as Dana Scott, who's a professor at York University, calls it extraction in a new shade of green. So in March of this year, the government of Ontario released what they called a critical minerals strategy. And their big argument is that Ontario is home to mineral deposits that are critical to clean technology and energy sectors, which means that if we mine those minerals, we can facilitate an economic recovery, enhance local supply chains, create jobs, and also somehow contribute or create this green economy. And in particular, they're saying that Ontario could become a leader in the future of electric vehicles and battery manufacturing. And this is particularly relevant to folks who are living and working in Oshawa and are likely very invested in this issue. However, this production relies on mining these critical minerals in Northern Ontario, in a region that's been referred to as the Ring of Fire, which has large nickel, copper, zinc, gold, and chromite deposits. But this region, the Ring of Fire, is also home to several small and remote Anishinaabe communities who have been defending their inherent jurisdiction to their homelands and speaking out against mining on their territories, and the importance of this geographical region in particular to their communities and to the environment in general. And we've already seen the impact that climate change has on these areas in Northern Ontario, and the impact that it will have in the years to come. So recently, Attawapiskat, Fort Albany, and Neskantaga First Nations in the James Bay Lowlands have called for a moratorium on mining in the region until a proper regional impact assessment report has been completed, consistent with the Crown's duty to consult. And so we've been standing in solidarity with those First Nations who've also been experiencing a lot of kind of state-sanctioned or state-created emergency situations, such as the lack of clean drinking water for decades. And now we're really concerned that the government is framing a just transition as one that must rely heavily on new mining projects, specifically in the far north of Ontario. And this addresses some of the questions that Amanda raised, specifically like what are we transitioning to and how do we get there? It kind of speaks to that how piece. And we're concerned that the process towards a green economy will have its sacrifice zones, just as the fossil fuel economy did, and that there will be certain communities and areas that will reap those benefits and parts that will be sacrificed and have to suffer the consequences of this transition. And that's not what a real transition would look like for us. And I think that labor has a really interesting role to play here, as most of these new jobs that's part of this critical minerals strategy will be in the mining and auto industries. And these are workers in industries that have been typically upheld or been subject to the fossil fuel economy and are now arguably essential in moving us away from it. And I recognize, of course, that this is really tricky work. I recognize the urgency that workers feel in finding work and the tension within unions, all the politics involved. But I do think that, as Kevin mentioned, it's part of the fight for long-term sustainable work. And these are industries that rely on and sustain the fossil fuel economy that will always be subject to booms and busts. And so there's like inherent precarity to that work. And that might be the base of an argument that can be used to organize workers around these issues. And I know I'm running out of time, but I just really want to quickly talk about green collective agreements too, which is something I've been thinking a lot about lately. There's a database which I can share in the chat that collects green collective agreements in Canada and internationally. And I think that it could be a really interesting way to use collective bargaining and the process of building, of organizing workers and building power within a local as also a way to kind of build climate literacy within the local and amongst workers. So examples of some of these green collective agreements are benefits to employees who carpool or take transit, extreme weather disaster clauses, green procurement clauses, training and courses available to workers on environmental justice issues, environmental justice committees, things like that. So I think that green collective agreements could be a really interesting way to kind of get workers engaged in these issues in a way that actually has like concrete and material benefits to them. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. So our next speaker is another person who has a direct Oshawa connection. Yay. It's Shailene, who's a member of CUPE and has background as well in campus environmental activism, and is currently a really powerful advocate for justice and youth empowerment here in Durham region. So go ahead, Shailene.
Thank you. Good afternoon, folks. Sorry, my internet's a little unstable, so if it starts to cut out, I may have to turn my camera off, but very excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me and for organizing, folks. I do first want to acknowledge the land that I am on as well. I'm on the land of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Mississauga Island First Nations, and our land here in Oshawa, especially in the north section here, is governed by the Williams Treaty of 1923. So to sort of jump into it, I took some notes to kind of keep me on track here, so I hope folks don't mind. But ultimately, I want to piggyback off of a lot what was said because it was already articulated so fantastically, and I sort of just want to add that intersectional lens that I value so much when we are doing this work. So I think my first point would be that you really have to, when you're doing any sort of advocacy work, organization work, whatever, meet people where they're at. And I think for a lot of folks, environmental activism, environmental socialism, environmental justice, just transitions seem to be a siloed off issue. It is something that if you are an environmentalist or someone who is active in climate justice, you cannot be anything else. And it could not be more far from the truth. And I think a lot of us here know that. Many people here seem to wear more than one hat. And the activist community seems to be like that all the time anyway. And I feel as though there is a misunderstanding there that in working for things like racial equity or disability rights or just anything, it's we are siloed and cut off from one another. And if you are not 100% in that one silo, you're not considered doing enough. And that can be really damaging, because I feel a lot of us know what burnout feels like when you are dedicating so much time, energy, research, and advocacy time to these things. So meeting people where they're at, because I think a just transition can sound very scary for folks who don't have the luxury and privilege of being able to tap into what is happening in the communities around them. I mean, a year ago, we had the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protest rally in Oshawa, and I have never seen so many people in Oshawa show up and show out for something. But if you look at the context of the time we're in, people were in lockdown, and they had the time. They had the time to tap in, to tune into what was happening in the world around them. And I think it was Kevin who had articulated it really, really well, that when you are a worker and you're hearing about just transitions and your job might be up on the chopping block, your first and foremost priority is survival. And that is human nature. And so when I say meet people where they're at, it's meeting people where their issues in their daily lives allow them to be, and helping bring them along in our movement. And I don't think it can be a transition if we're not doing that effectively, and not in a way that is confrontational or oppositional, because people get that enough, right? I wanted to also build on collaborative allyship and coalition building. I think a lot of people have already articulated it well, but when we're looking at, I mean, I'm starting to build a campaign here in Oshawa again, and we're looking at the 4 pillars that we want to focus on this time. And environmental justice has to be one of those, but so does racial justice, so does political justice, so does social justice. You know, there's so many other pieces to it, and it's finding ways to bridge them together and showing people that one cannot happen without the other, and that everyone has something to contribute to the movement, no matter your walk of life, your academic background, your experience. I mean, if you look at this call, look at the different generational groups that we have on this call, right? That is significant. And if you're not building multi-generational, cross-generational movements, you're not doing enough to make sure that you have all levels of epistemic knowledge, that lived experience, but then also vision, generational differences in what it's like growing up in different communities. Things change. That as opposed to fear it or divide ourselves up into generational blocks and say, I don't want to listen to what you have to say because it was different in your time. That doesn't work. It's never worked, and it's not going to here. And so I think ultimately, because I know my time's almost up, when you're building intersectional movements and building momentum, I found that mobilization via social media is very accessible for those of us that use it, and not so accessible for those that don't. And so having mixed mediums, but I've also found that visuals are so powerful. So being present on the social media platforms where people are and target them, right? I know that some of my older family members use Facebook more than Twitter and Instagram. And so tailor your content so that it's accessible, it's hitting the different language and understanding points that you want to hit for who you're targeting, and make people feel welcome, that you're welcome to bring them along and educate them, and that they don't have to come to the table knowing everything already. There's some brilliant minds on this call who I can learn from, who others can learn from, and I feel as though when you foster an environment where people want to learn from one another, that is when we are most effective in our mobilization and activism efforts. And so I think I'll end it there because I think my time is up, but ultimately, making sure at all times that when we are focused on any type of activism, especially environmental activism, that we really highlight how intersectional to everything else it is, so people can feel connected to it in a way that I don't think they always have. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's such an important component of this for sure. So next we have Polo. Polo lives here in Oshawa as well. and is generally pretty involved in the community, has worked with a few different groups that work alongside the unions and labor groups here in the city, and is currently, I think, getting involved in a lot of stuff with housing and local government issues, which is certainly connected to just transition as well. So take it away, Polo.
Thanks, Francesca. Can you hear me? These are new headphones, so I just want to check you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you. First of all, I think that Francesca might know every single left-leaning activist in the whole of Canada, which has led to a really entertaining and interesting conversation. But also, for me, I do tend to think quite broadly about ideas. So I think that coming after Shailene is a little bit interesting because I think she's speaking more about specific things that we can do, but that's not generally how my chaotic mind works. So it's kind of shows that there is a place for these kind of conversations to bring up all different levels of conversation. So a lot of the time when I hear about a just transition or Green New Deal, I think like others have said, it has been co-opted. It doesn't mean what we mean when the general population is talking about it, especially when the government's talking about it. And if a company talks about it, then who even knows what they're talking about? So it can seem in general conversation like a just transition is going from exploiting workers to make regular cars to exploiting workers to make electric cars. Like it doesn't involve any kind of actual change. It's just what they're exploited for. So we might stop exploiting the environment, but we're not stopping exploiting workers. And I think that's something that's really important. So I understand wanting and needing to make lives better in the system we're in. I mean, I work for a bank. I'm a hypocrite if I say otherwise, that you have to make a life in the system that you're in. But I think the conversation lacks depth if we don't look at the transition away from capitalism at the same time. Like Amanda was saying, I really liked that talking about imagining a post-capitalist future is an essential part of this process, at least to me. And I think a lot of towards the movement in general. If we can't picture a future where we're not just exploiting someone else in a different way, then what's the point of working towards any of it? We're still just going to be exploiting. We may not be exploiting the environment, we're still exploiting people. And as a queer person, I know that imagining different futures is the only way to move forward in any kind of meaningful way. So what I worry about happening is that the exploitation inherent in this system will continue, even if we manage to move towards a greener economy. I don't see a true way forward without challenging that. If we make deals with the government and neoliberal corporations, like I'm saying, you do have to try and improve the world that we're living in as we're living in it. But if we make deals with them, they may say they're on board with a just transition, but of course what that means is that they're on board with the label and the clout behind it, not necessarily with what it means, and they will shed anything along the way that's actually truly meaningful, sustainable, equitable, anything that benefits workers, anything that does not benefit a neoliberal economy. And like Josh was saying, we can't just change the meaning of just transition and then believe that we've achieved it, even if it feels nice, because we've moved away from using carbon-based energy without actually facing against capitalism and against exploitation. So we need to stop exploiting workers alongside the exploitation of the government, of the environment. I don't think I've ever said exploitation so many times in a 5-minute period. And I know this is very broad, and there are things that we have to do within the system that we're in, but keeping that in our mind that we cannot, workers will never be centered in the current neoliberal capitalist system. It's just not compatible with the system that we're in, even if we want it to be. So I do think on a more like actually answering one of the questions that Francesca sent over, I do think that Green Jobs Oshawa is doing a great job focusing on campaign-based work, as people need to see progress to see that it's possible. And I hope that that continues, and also that, like this conversation, engaging with broader groups of people and recognizing the intersectionality of what we're doing, and that it's essential to work on anti-poverty, anti-oppression against different races, different genders, against the hatred against queer people, against different religions. Like, all of this comes together to the same meaning. And I also agree that the siloing is very harmful. And I know that I've had this conversation a bit with Francesca, that relationships can play a big part within activism in a harmful way. And I see the smirk on Francesca's face, because like, me and her definitely have directly had experience with this within our own community, and it's not a healthy way. So on the ground level, we have to work out how to all work together, even with different people. Like Shailene was saying, meet people where they're at, but also never compromise on the inherent values and what we're doing. And I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Polo. Yeah, forgiveness and trust have to be a big part of our work going forward, for sure. Next, we have Trevor. Trevor is a volunteer with Greenpeace, and he also helped out Environmental Action Now Ajax Pickering this past winter when they were fighting to protect Duffins Creek from development. So Trevor is a true blue, or true green, I guess, environmentalist, and I'm so excited to hear what he has to say.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Cool. All right. Well, I am relatively new to the activism game. I've only been volunteering with Greenpeace Toronto for about a year and a half. So I'm relatively new to the environmental movement as well. I've really enjoyed being able to participate here today, because I'm learning so much. And that's the thing, like, I really don't know that much compared to everyone else on the panel. So just to be here and to be hearing some of these ideas is awesome. Francesca, I forwarded you an email that I got from one of the Greenpeace staffers, because really, like, me by myself, I don't really have, I think, much meaningful ideas to contribute on organizing at this sort of scale, because I just don't have the experience. But I'm more than happy to, like, offer my support and eventually become more involved. So I reached out to the Greenpeace staff to find out what Greenpeace Canada has been doing more in their work as far as working with labor unions. And one of their staffers who works on an energy campaign got back to me and said that Greenpeace Canada has collaborated here and there with unions over the years. And he gave me an example of a Green Jobs report that they conducted in 2016 with the Alberta Green Economy Network, and an earlier report they did in 2009 with the Alberta Federation of Labor. And I mean, just not having that much knowledge on the subject, I skimmed through these reports, and they're very well researched, research intensive. So they talk about, basically it seemed like making the pitch for, yes, this is possible in Alberta to do these things. And it was in collaboration with some of what sound like pretty big unions in the area. The Greenpeace staffer also told me that Greenpeace Canada is part of the Green Economy Network. I was not aware of that until a few days ago, but it says on their website, it's a coalition of labor, environmental, and social justice organizations working to build a green economy in Canada. So it sounds like exactly what we're talking about here. So I don't know if anyone else on the call is aware or part of the Green Economy Network. It's the first I am learning about it. And he said, the Greenpeace staffer, his name's Alex, he said that sometimes Greenpeace Canada will just sign on and offer their support for some of the Green Economy Network's releases. And he gave me an example of something from the Canadian Labour Congress's website. Basically, it said a network of labor, environmental, and social justice groups demand Prime Minister signal significant investment in green economy and speech from the throne. So it was back in 2019, after the Liberals were elected for the second time. It seems like a bunch of groups in these different areas all got together and just sort of had a united push for that to be in the speech from the throne. The only other thing I have that was sharing, Alex said that he doesn't think Greenpeace Canada has laid out in details some of the demands for a Just Transition Act for Canada, which is what I'm sort of more interested in just as a volunteer, because like I've scrolled through the federal government's website, like the page for a Just Transition Act, and it talks about a lot of cool things like setting up transition centers in the impacted communities where people can literally go in and get financial, like apply for financial support, apply for retraining, just like having a physical location. So like one of the speakers said, if you can see it, like you can actually see change happening, then people are easier to get on board than if it's just all talking. But he said that Greenpeace Canada would be supportive of proposals outlined in a recent, what do we call it here? the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives report on a Just Transition Act. And just scrolling through that, they make a number of suggestions that Just Transition Act legislation would have to include. And I was happy to read that a number of them involve ensuring access for historically marginalized groups, and also just providing the financial support directly to workers in affected communities. So again, it's very technical. Again, I just had time to look through it, but yeah, so Greenpeace, from what I have found out just as a volunteer, doesn't seem to have it specifically detailed, which is a little disappointing for me because, I mean, if it was specific, I'd be able to understand it a little more and get more behind it and hopefully be able to explain it to people as well. But yeah, and it's probably just for the fact that they're probably waiting for or looking to work in collaboration with groups like unions and other environmental groups to get behind like specific language for the act. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Again, happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And any of the groups, just let me know if Greenpeace Toronto can support you guys in any way, because we're a small group, but we're willing to come out to events and organize. And we were just organizing last week for a global week of action to stop funding the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So we're willing to get out there, and thank you for the time.
Thank you, Trevor. Yeah, feel free to drop some of those links that you had emailed into the chat. I think it's always nice to see how really large environmental organizations are tackling this issue. I think it's definitely like mixed concreteness, as you're saying. And a lot of the groups here today are much more grassroots. So it's really nice to kind of get that info, and we can dig in and think about how to try to connect the really specific local organizing that's so important to some of those larger structures, which is a good segue into our last but not least speaker, which is Robin from Council of Canadians. And Council of Canadians are actually very active right now at trying to connect local campaigns in their Green New Deal Communities network. So go ahead, Robin.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about that network too. My name is Robin, Council of Canadians campaigner. I'm calling in from Mi'kma'ki on the East Coast in Halifax today, but I work at a kind of national scope. So that's how I got connected, or I got connected with Green Jobs Oshawa through our Green New Deal work. And I want to just like tell you a little bit about this network we're trying to pull together, and then the reasons why we think organizing in that way is needed right now. So we have a project we're calling Green New Deal Communities, where we're working with community groups in all places and anywhere across Canada, where people are trying to run local campaigns relating to the goals of the Green New Deal and just transition, just recovery. And we're trying to offer direct support for those locally rooted campaigns. And so what that means is like to be part of this network, basically the requirement is like you want to be there and you want to run a campaign which has a goal and like a plan to engage people in accomplishing that goal in some time frame. And we're offering direct support to those folks in a number of ways, depending on what is needed in the local context. And I think it's really important that we're not telling people what exactly types of campaigns they should run, because I think when, in my experience of being a volunteer and then a staff with lots of more environmentally focused NGOs, when the national level comes and tells people locally what goals are appropriate and what's going to move people, it's not usually that effective, because those national level goals aren't informed by the local experience. So yeah, we're offering some direct support for those local groups. We're trying to connect people together also. So we've had a number of like skill building workshops and conversational spaces for people across these different community campaigns to come together and just talk about their experience of like what it's like to be running more locally focused Green New Deal campaigns, what they're learning, what kind of obstacles they're coming up against, all kinds of things. And then doing some skill building to help make sure that people have the capacity they need to do those local campaigns. And then the third part of this is we're still kind of getting there. This is a newer project, but we're trying to learn from those local projects and campaigns to inform what a bigger scale Green New Deal, or like what a big transformative policy package could include, and why we need those kinds of specific transformations. We're just kind of getting to that point where we can be drawing more conclusions from that local work. And I think the reason it feels really important to work at a local scale, I mean, there are many, and two I'll mention here is that in my time, maybe like 10 years of working in environmental and climate justice movements, it's clear to me that our movements don't have the power yet that we need to make the transformations that we want to see and that we've all been talking about. Because if we did have that organized power, we would have done it already. So we need to organize ourselves. We need to get ourselves much more organized. And I think also a lot of what has been tried in the last 10 years, in my knowledge, is like, it seems to me that there's like local grassroots groups responding to local demands. And then there's these national level groups that are trying to respond to national policy contexts. And there's a huge gap between them, and they're not often speaking to each other. And in my experience I'm really coming from a climate justice background. I'm newer to labor organizing. And I think my experience trying to connect as someone on the like environmental side coming to labor and trying to figure out how to make those connections, the successes I've seen haven't been at the top where like the Council of Canadians and Unifor get along very well, but the better connections come from the grassroots, where locally, like we're all noticing here, like we all wear many hats, we all participate in our communities in a number of ways, and it's easier at a community level, at a local level, to like combat the weird like isolation and separation that we experience in so many ways in capitalism, and by participate or by our like memberships in larger organizations. And it's just a lot easier to make like human to human relationships at a local level, where we can be like, I'm a worker, I'm an environmentalist, and I live here and I want to stay here. Like it's easier to build those kinds of relationships that can help to bring together larger national oriented organizations that are more disparate and might have different goals. So those are some of the reasons we're working at that local level, and that I think is really important. I was just jotting some notes. I didn't have a very prepared speech like many other people, but I have a few notes. Yeah, I also think that working at a community level to define these goals like Green Jobs Oshawa has is so important, because when a few people said this, like when people are faced with their own like survival needs, there's like immediate material needs that are not being met by the current society because it's inherently like capitalism just doesn't do that for people. I think at a local level, if we can run locally focused campaigns that kind of fall under this big Green New Deal or whatever umbrella, but make them relevant to people's material lives now, then you can address local problems and tie those local and immediate experiences to this larger vision of transition. So I think that's a really important piece of like the campaign that you're talking about with Green Jobs Oshawa to transform the plant, like materially. That's kind of where that's for me what it comes down to, and that's a very obvious piece. That's so locally relevant to Oshawa that wouldn't make any sense in Halifax. We don't have manufacturing that's shut down like that. We actually have a brand new boat building factory, which is miserable because it builds warships. But anyway, so it's like that kind of responding to that kind of the very local experience is so powerful for getting people to become involved and to open their minds to thinking about this kind of big transformation that we're talking about. And Shailene, I was really liking what you said of like meeting people where they're at and actually speaking to people about their material conditions is like, that's kind of the core idea of working at this local level to build up the power in a larger movement. I feel like I'm getting very repetitive now. One other thought on my mind is, I think a few people touched on this, like one thing that's exciting about like a just transition type of frame is that we can move from like protesting stuff only to like proposing, like moving from protest to proposition, like actually putting forward a vision and working towards the like positive vision rather than just like, no this, no that. I think that is more inviting for more people, and like we need to grow the power of our movement, and that means getting a bit more organized with the people who are already part of it and reaching out beyond that to talk to other people to organize people who are not yet organized. And so I think it is a bit easier these days to talk to people about a specific proposition. I'm getting a bit rambly. I think that it just feels hypercritical to me to have concrete campaigns with goals that are tangible and specific so that we can ask people to join in supporting something specific and use that both to make some specific and material changes and to open people's minds to like a broad transition. And I think that's part of why I'm somewhat obsessed with Green Jobs Oshawa, because it's such a clear and fantastic, it's a clear vision, it's a clear demand, but it is also totally transformational. It's not some kind of reform. It's like quite rad. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not being super coherent anymore, so maybe I'll stop there, but I'm really enjoying this conversation. I'm glad to be here with all of you.
Thank you, Robin. I feel the same way in terms of obsession, and I was not involved in the founding of Green Jobs Oshawa, so I was very like obsessed with it from the outside, and then it's really great to be involved.
Sorry, I did have one more thing I wanted to share, and I have a friend from my childhood who lives in Oshawa now, and she is like not involved in movements, not an activist, very upper middle class, totally professional person, general green orientation, but she sent me a message the other day randomly, and I was like, you live in Oshawa now, have you heard about this? And I sent her the Green Jobs Oshawa petition, and she like lost her shit. She was so happy. She signed it, she sent it to her husband. Her husband grew up in Oshawa. Like both of these people are like very professional, not related to climate or labor movements, and they were like, they're dying to see the mural and they're here for it. So that just like gave me a bit of hope that like just talking to regular people about this is really probably going to get a lot of support, and I would love to help figure out how exactly to pull that off.
Okay, we're gonna follow up about that, Robin. That was amazing. I'm like so relieved that we ended up with 10 people instead of 15 because that was just like so much, and it's amazing. We're going to take a break. I think we're going to do a 5-minute break just because we are tight for time, and that's enough for everyone to stretch. I'm dropping a link in the chat, which is to a jam board where I've been just taking notes on what people have been saying, and you do have editing access with that link. So, I mean, don't vandalize it, but if folks want to add stars or exclamation points to what other people have said, you can. But really, it's just kind of if that's going to help you identify what a biggest like lesson or takeaway for you was. When we come back from the break, we're going to do a really quick lightning round, like probably 30 seconds to 1 minute each. I'll do the math of how much time we have to share our takeaways, and then we'll wrap up. So I think we're going to come back at 2:45. So we're back from break. There are 17 people here and 15 minutes left. So, and I'm actually going to call on everyone, not just our roundtable participants, but Green Jobs Oshawa people here too. So let's truly, like, even if it's one word, like 30 seconds to a minute each, just what is the biggest thing that has jumped out to you today as maybe like how to move forward or what you're going to be reflecting on. I will go first. What I've been thinking about just now is, it might sound fluffy, but the role that kindness plays in movement, because community and being responsive to local demands is so key and so powerful. Organizing people is obviously what we have to do, growing that base, and you can't do that if you are not kind and if you don't genuinely love your community and love your vision of the future. So that's mine. I'm just going to go right down the participants list. So the next on the list is Tony. Tony, what's your takeaway?
The worker class is the vast majority of our society, which is a key reason that what we have to do has to be centered on the working class. But also the working class has the power, because of their situation in the economy, to bring the country to a halt. And if that power can be mobilized for the kind of transformative change that we're talking about, then we have a real chance of bringing about change. Those are two of the key lessons that I would pick up from different things that people said. But I also want to go back to how Herman started out by talking about the vital importance of separating union leadership from identifying with corporations or a corporate mindset. Because when we talk about providing jobs, and a lot of people talked about how just transition has to provide jobs, it can't be butchered into being, we're supporting jobs, therefore we have to have the Trans Mountain Pipeline, or we're supporting jobs, therefore we have to continue polluting Boat Harbor in Nova Scotia, so and disregard the Indigenous community that's impacted, or we have to have jobs, so we have to keep building light armored vehicles for Saudi Arabia. So I don't know if that's the moral component that some people talked about, but it's certainly a component for having a broader vision of the kind of world we want to build. And so we have to identify jobs in a broader sense, not in the narrow sense.
Okay. Remember, 30 seconds to 1 minute, everyone. So the next person is Julia. Julia is our newer Labor Council, Durham Region Labor Council representative here on Green Jobs Oshawa.
I think what I take away from this is that there's like so many different groups working in different places on somewhat similar goals, and there's sort of some common understandings, but I don't think people still really understand sort of the two sides of this or together to pull it together. I think Green Jobs Oshawa is trying to articulate a vision where it pulls everything together. But to get everybody pulling in the same direction is going to be very challenging. And and it needs really concrete demonstrations. And I'm just thinking about how many workers that I know in Oshawa that have been in the plant who are also the environmental leaders and have done amazing work. I'm thinking of the work of Dave Renault, who had a lot of leadership. He's retired now from CAWGM. I'm thinking of people like Jim Richards. I'm thinking of people like Larry Ladd, who just continue to make, and I'm thinking the broader environment is not necessarily the plant environment. They're not talking about the plant environment, but who have worked in an industry and yet that's producing cars, and GM produces a lot of other kinds of pollutants. Arsenic comes out of it. There's all kinds of shit that comes out of that plant and has been used to dump all over the city and just has made an environmental nightmare for cleanup. and brownfields and everything else. But those people who have participated in those industries are also the leaders in other aspects of environmental action. So that gives me hope. Hope.
We love hope. Okay, next is Addie.
Right. Okay, minutes to 30 seconds.
Yeah. Oh, Addie's frozen.
So I've been involved in okay, sounds like it's working now. So I've been involved in environmental activism for 2 years. And like the two main feelings that I keep on returning to, despite knowing better and having all evidence to the contrary, is one, the feeling that there's no hope and we're all doomed and stuff, and two, like just this feeling of being alone. But my takeaway from this is just more evidence to the contrary, that there's so many people who
I think we lost Addie again.
we can work with.
You might have to turn off your
so many people here who have. Okay. What point did I lose you guys at?
The last thing I heard you say is there are so many people we can work with.
Yeah. There's just like so many people who have so many great campaigns and ideas, and who have done so much amazing work that we can, that each of us can rely on and each of us can work with. So my takeaway is that, there is hope and there is other people involved. Yeah.
Great. Okay, next we have Amanda.
Sure, thanks. I guess my three main takeaways are, one, that there are real obstacles to transformative change at all levels, with union locals, with government, with policy. But two, that there are, I think, a lot more people thinking about a just transition in a transformative sense than we may realize, and that there's a lot of untapped potential and excitement and desire for something better than what our present economy provides. And three, the importance of local work with broader regional dialogue and coordination, like what we're doing today.
I love it. Herman, you're next. Don't talk for more than a minute.
Oh no, I sort of said mostly I wanted to say. I was just I want to watch this again because I was fascinated by the different aspects that people raised. One for me is the eco and socialists together. Nobody mentioned the term social. They talk about past capitalism, but for me that's a critical component. And secondly is the question of class, but class doesn't exist without forms of oppression that exist that stray out the economy and also affect the working class. We have to change those things. And the question of scale. There's so much of this stuff that people talked about. Like I said, I want to listen to it again. But I think one of the main lessons I found is a lot of very thoughtful young people who I'd like to learn from. And I hope you get involved in Green Jobs Oshawa or something similar because, there's a lot of thoughtfulness there. And I was very impressed by it. So there you go.
Thank you. Okay, next is James.
I suppose the main thing that I took away from this was a feeling of hope, as Julia mentioned. There's a perception in every form of oppression that the oppressed class is stupid or is destined to be there because of some sort of nature, especially when there's a perception of people working menial labor, but that's obviously not the case. That these people who go to work in these plants don't just go home and crack open a beer and sit in front of the TV. They really care about their lives, and all workers do, but especially people who are as essential to the community as this. And that just brings me that feeling of hope.
Thank you. Next is Josh.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the same feelings that everybody else has had. Francesca, I like your centering of kindness. I think that's actually really important and something we need to sort of rediscover, that you don't have to prove in quantitative terms your own oppression, and some things, we can also just be kind to each other. But yeah, I mean, I think the main things I took away were the importance of fighting alienation and building community, which is difficult, I think, but opportunities arise, and we can't constantly be rebuilding our movement every time an opportunity arises. We have to be ready for it, and that involves a lot of long-term movement, a lot of long-term organization, also I think, to echo Herman's point, that it's not enough just to be anti something. We do need to present a vision for a future, a socialist vision for the future, to give people something to work towards. Thanks.
Love it. Kevin, you are next for your last word.
Listening to everyone, it certainly shows how steep the climb is, and it's refreshing. It gives hope to listen to everybody. We need to have more of these, because it's easy to feel alone right now, especially in these times, right? So that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks again for speaking earlier. Next is Lisa.
My biggest takeaway is optimism. I'm pretty optimistic about this conversation and where we're heading. And I think, there's a lot of potential in sort of having the creativity to imagine a future beyond capitalism, and sort of thinking about what do we want our future to look like, and sort of pushing the boundaries of what's possible. Yes, this conversation is, sort of reignited that optimism of the work that we're doing and that we have to do.
I love that. Okay, Polo, you're next.
I agree about kindness and love being so important, and also it does, even this much in 2-hour conversation, and so many people are talking about coming away with such hope, and I would agree. And I think part of that is because imagining a future and talking about how to bring that future into life is turning that love and kindness into action, and that's inspiring to me.
Thank you. Next is Rebecca, who's one of our coordinators here in Green Jobs Oshawa.
Sorry. So first, I found this absolutely inspiring. I loved hearing what everybody else is doing, especially it gives you a sense of not being so alone in the fight. I guess the one thing that really comes across to me when we're talking about this is that people care, not just the people on this call, but all over the place. People care. They're not apathetic, and it's something that we have to be very careful of when we're getting frustrated. I know I hear all the time when people say people just don't care, they don't want to participate, we're doing these good things and they're not showing up or whatever, but they do care. And people are absolutely political. Maybe they don't want to talk about the Liberals or the Conservatives, but they care, and they are political. They care about how we live, and they care about the future that we're going to have. So I think that one of the things that we really need to do is expand the conversation and transform how we give people the opportunity to participate in all of the good things that we're doing. Because people do care, and it's absolutely inspirational listening to all of the work that you folks have been doing. So thank you so much for coming today and sharing.
Thank you, Rebecca. Next is Shailene.
Going to try with my camera on. I think the thing that has been most inspiring to me, and I'll echo what other folks have said, is that there are so many people with so much experience, insights, and ideas, and I really feel like the areas where some of us individually may not be as strong, we fill in for each other. And so it's just reassuring that we can all protect our energy and not burn ourselves out, but also still be collaborative and connected. And so thanks again for having us in this space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true and so amazing. Sydney, you are next.
So I think this conversation just really reminded me that, as we also kind of found it in the pandemic, that industry and government won't protect us, and they definitely won't be the ones leading this just transition. So we really need to build solidarity in our communities, and as many folks repeated, kind of meet people where they're at. And Yeah, I really appreciated others sharing what organizing tactics could look like on the ground to do that. And yeah, I think that's something that I'll be thinking about as well after this.
Love it. Okay, we have Trevor. Trevor is next.
Just to thank you for all of the information presented today. I guess my main takeaway is please send me and the other groups information on your campaigns, upcoming activities, because like I said earlier, I'm a foot soldier. I don't have all the experience or knowledge, but I am passionate about the environment and I'm willing to wholeheartedly support you guys in any way I can. So please send information my way. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure, Trevor. We will do that. We also have, I'm saving the last person on the list of participants is Vic, and I want to give him the last word because I'm hoping he'll have a nice pun for us. But we also have a message from Robin who had to go. So Robin's takeaway is that she has a lot of hope and feels affirmed that committing to locally rooted campaigns is a good strategic choice. Herman says we're all foot soldiers. Okay, so unless I skipped anyone else, Vic, you're the last person to share their takeaway.
Okay. You know, when a worker loses their job, they lose a lot of hope, and when enough workers in the community lose a job, the community loses their identity, and we have to bridge that gap. Right now, we're giving a lot of hope, but hope is not going to pay their mortgage. So hopefully we can get enough people on board to give people hope, but with a job attached to it, and not the way it is right now when people are starving for work. You know, they're just going to grab the first thing. So we have to be a viable alternative. And I like what the people said about the mining community. If we're going to undermine the community by mining the community, we're making no progress. And that's it for me.
That's great. Okay, I thought you might go funny, but you went sobering and it was very powerful. So I think that's everyone shared their takeaway. So that's a really good segue to just how we wanted to wrap up, which is to say that anyone who wants to get involved with Green Jobs Oshawa, you're absolutely welcome. We have our small organizing committee that's been running things, and that's, you know, open if you want to help out with that. But we're also really trying to build to the place where we have more of a general membership and we have multiple working groups as well. And one of the working groups that we really want to have in the future is one that really tries to seed just transition campaigns like Green Jobs Oshawa in other cities and kind of digs into that really tricky stuff of how does the actual organizing work on the ground? How do you reach people who have not yet been reached, but who, as Rebecca says, the capacity is totally there. People are political and they just, and you know, they need somebody to pull them in and build that capacity to really do something. Anyways, that was a very confusing way of saying that we would love to have a working group with a lot of you involved one day. We would love to have you as general membership down the line. So just keep in touch, follow us, and reach out by email whenever you want. But also, yeah, if anyone wants to come to one of our organizing committee meetings or anything like that, we can talk about short-term helping out as well. Although I know you all have your own things that you're involved in. So I'm going to save the meeting chat as always and send out links that people have shared. There's been really great conversation there. Tony's been recording and there'll be a recording of this up at some point. But other than that, I just really want to thank everyone so much. This went really well. And I too am feeling very inspired and hopeful. So